Hi everyone, welcome to the PMI. I wanted to start just with our acknowledgement of country, so I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands we're meeting on today. Sovereignty was never ceded. And I'd also like to acknowledge the rich traditions of knowledge keeping and knowledge management that have been in this place for thousands of years. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming out tonight to hear about the rare books of the PMI Victorian History Library. My name's Ellen, I'm the Collections Librarian here, and I oversee the management of our 40,000 plus collection. Just before we go any further, there's just a little bit of admin. So we have a gold coin donation jar down the back. If everyone can contribute, that would be amazing. And there's also an email sign-up list down there. So if you want to hear more about our fantastic events and what we're doing in the library, sign up over there. And in the very unlikely event of an emergency, go in the direction the fire isn't, but just follow staff. So there's emergency exits out that side and that side. And if you need to use the bathroom during any of the event, it's just go right and it's first door on the left. And I'll be taking questions at the end, but if you've got any really burning questions, I can probably cope with being interrupted as well. This is also where I normally do the admin bit about the history of the PMI and spruik us a little bit before I hand it over to the speaker. But as I'm actually talking about the history of the PMI tonight, I thought I'd leave that bit out. So tonight I am going to lead you through the story of the PMI in rare books and ephemera. So like any organisation of its age, we've been around for 170 years. The narrative of the PMI is shaped by the objects that survive to tell it. This is true both of archival material and the collection itself. We also actively track down rare material, so I'm going to talk a bit about rare collecting of the future, and especially COVID collecting, which is creating rare material, and about building a collection. But to begin at the beginning, the PMI is in many ways rare itself. While there were over 1,000 mechanics institutes in Victoria by 1900, there are currently only 8 that run a lending library, and only 5 of those have professionally staffed lending libraries. So we declared ourselves into existence on the 1st of May 1854, which, as I said, makes us 170 next year. We're the second oldest library in Victoria. We beat the State Library by 3 months. They technically had a building before we did, but we existed before they did. The Athenaeum in the city is the oldest. They were founded in 1839 for anyone who's interested. But before I go any further, what is a Mechanics Institute? Firstly, it has absolutely nothing to do with cars. So a couple of years ago, I had a phone call from someone who was a motorist who was stranded in Chapel Street. And I had to tell her that while I might be able to provide a book on the history of her car, I wouldn't be able to do much about fixing it. So the term mechanic is essentially a 19th century term for a blue-collar worker. The first instance of the concept behind Mechanics Institutes came in roughly 1799/1800, there's a bit of disagreement on that, when Dr. George Birkbeck, this lovely dapper gentleman on the screen, gave a series of lectures to skilled labourers about the history of their tools and how they were physically made. And they were held outside normal working hours so that they were actually able to attend these talks. And this was a period of time when free education opportunities for adults weren't common, unless, of course, you could pay for it. So the lectures were popular enough that they became the foundation for Mechanics Institutes, with the first one opening in Edinburgh in 1821, followed by the London Mechanics Institute in 1823. They were founded to provide educational opportunities for adults through talks and facilities such as chess, pianos, and most importantly, as far as the PMI is concerned, lending libraries. So the founder of the PMI was Reverend William Moss, he of the fairly majestic beard in the middle there, and 2 of the original trustees. So you've got Frederick James Sargood, who's the father of the Sargood who built Ripon Lee, for anyone who's playing along at home, and George Rusden, who's the gentleman over on the right there. The other founder was Dr. James Stokes, who we actually don't have a photo of, unfortunately. So Moss was a congregational minister, and it was at his instigation that the original meeting was held on the 1st of May 1854. In his speech on the night, Mr. Orlebar, who I still haven't quite worked out exactly how he fits in, spoke at length about the PMI's aims. The speech was recorded in the Argus, naturally, and I thought I'd read you the opening so you can have an idea of the lofty ambitions of the founders. The institution has for its aims, first, the rational recreation, and secondly, the intellectual improvement of artisans. Continued peace and the onward progress of civilization have made the artisans to be a class increasing in numbers and rising in importance throughout the world, especially in our native land. And the very peculiar circumstances of this colony have made the artisan so wealthy and thriving and give him so reasonable an expectation of continued prosperity that he feels an independence and an elevation in his social condition which he has never enjoyed in any former part of history. In this position, he feels dignity as a man. He demands some higher enjoyment than those pleasures which are common to the brute animal. He desires to elevate and polish his mind. He is willing to open his purse to obtain the means of gratifying his instinct for the acquisition of knowledge, which is common to the whole human race. A year ago, it was generally said in England that the best workmen had emigrated to these lands. We see the correctness of that opinion in some degree corroborated tonight, for no mean spirit could have originated a mechanics institute in a village in such a condition as ours. The mechanics of Prahran, though labouring under the disadvantages of recent colonisation, have commenced by a strong internal impulse a mechanics institution. They have done more. They have become the missionaries of civilization. So they certainly weren't thinking small, especially because at the time Prahran itself didn't have a town council. It was little more than a swamp. So this picture here is Prahran in 1864, so this is 10 years after the PMI was founded. This is looking down Chapel Street from the town hall. It is very important to note that the land wasn't unoccupied, as it had been Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country for tens of thousands of years. But from a European perspective, Prahran was quite remote. So the first rules of the PMI stated the purpose of the institute, and he did it a lot more succinctly than Mr. Oliver, thankfully, as the mental and moral improvement and rational recreation of its members by means of lectures, discussions, library, reading room, classes, museums, philosophical apparatus, etc. Purposes which we largely hold to today. And that brings us to the foundational documents of the PMI and our first of our rare iterations. I want to start what is probably the most important foundation document. This dates to July 1854 and is a letter on behalf of Governor and Lady Hotham. Remember, this predates Federation, so this is the colony of Victoria's colonial government, agreeing to be patrons of the PMI. This document shows the PMI establishing itself as part of the structure of colonial Victoria, as it becomes part of the local community and overall society. And I should add that 90% of stuff I'm putting on the screen is actually in the cabinets around the room, so feel free to have a more detailed look afterwards. So other documents illustrating the ongoing story of the PMI as we work to establish ourselves beyond what is just a concept. We have letters going back and forth about the funding for the construction of our first building in 1855. In 1855, the PMI was advised that the present state of the colony's finances didn't allow the government to give the PMI any more money for the building. Then once the money was sourced elsewhere, we have letters tendering for the new building and receipts for building supplies. So this, that one, and that one is a receipt for a building supply. So other early documents illustrate the ongoing story. That was a bit. And then by 1857, we have this incredible document, which is on display just over there on that table. This is the original invitation for the opening of our building in January 1857. It's printed on silk, and we have it by complete chance. I'll just quickly, before I tell you that, I'll just quickly explain the two different photos. So this is how we received it, and this is after it was restored. The colour difference is more to do with the light, but you can see the difference in condition. So in about 2014, we received a phone call from a New Zealand engineering company saying, "We found this in a drawer, would you like it?" At this point, we didn't even know it existed. So we were very pleased to have it back, and it's now, if there was a fire, I would grab this on the way out, pretty much, because it is literally irreplaceable. So the early story of the PMI is by necessity in rare letters and ephemera rather than books, as it took time for a collection to develop. and not all of the collection actually survived post the early 1900s, but I'll come back to the reasons for that later. So in the years after the building opened, you begin to see letters about entertainments, pianos. There's quite a few back and forth letters about who damaged the leg of the new piano. And we have dance cards for balls. So this one's actually a dance card from Kangaroo Ground from 1869, I think. Again, it's on display over there. And it was used as a sample for creating our own version. Unfortunately, the PMI's version doesn't survive. So yeah, it began to evolve beyond a principle. This evolution is reflected in the archives. So that's not to say that there wasn't a collection of books. So this catalogue from 1858 gives you a sort of idea of the books that the PMI was holding. It's largely a general collection of Western literature, non-fiction and periodicals. The categories they're collected under were agriculture, commerce, statistics, biography, speeches and correspondence. For any librarians in the audience, we predate the Dewey system. So we now use Dewey, but at this point they were sorting by their own version of subjects. We also have classics and philosophy, geography, and then that one is, history and historical memoirs, jurisprudence and legislative, mechanics, mathematical science, architecture, engineers and useful arts, medical science, chemistry and miscellaneous collective works, which is a bit of an odd category, music, natural history and botany, periodical literature and newspapers, philosophy and general science, poetry and drama, politics, religion and ecclesiastical works, and finally works of fiction and amusement and works of reference. Now these books were all held by the PMI in 1858, but you'll find very few, if any, still in the collection today, which is partly why we rely on these old catalogues. There's several reasons for this, partly because most would now not meet our collection policy. I'll come back to our specialisation a bit later, though we might have kept a heritage collection if we still held some of it. The key reasons that we no longer hold most of this material is two incidences, in the 1800s and the early 1900s. So the first real crisis came in 1868. This is our original building in Chapel Street. I'll explain why you can't see that anymore in a second. So the first real crisis came in 1868 when PMI Secretary William John Allen wrote an anonymous letter to the South Melbourne Standard in which he wasn't particularly pleasant about one of the PMI committee members. His name was Reverend Potter. For anyone who's interested, I actually found the page of the minute books, and that's on display over there, that discusses this incident. So they're recorded, Reverend Potter insisted that the letter was recorded in full in the minutes. So this letter was meant to be anonymous, but unfortunately for Ellen, the editor of the Standard was a friend of Potter's and ratted him out. So Ellen was summarily dismissed, but he refused to go as he believed his dismissal was unjust, which he might have actually had a point. What he did, though, brought the PMI to a standstill. At the time, the secretary was a live-in position, so Ellen refused to leave. He was effectively squatting in the building. So this is our original building in Chapel Street. This is this one on the screen. Oops, sorry. Oh, wait. This one on the screen here. The site of which we still own. So the PMI committee at the time came up with a novel solution. They moved in under the cover of darkness and took the roof off. Thus making the building unlivable and forcing Ellen out. So the PMI did end up in court over this, and you can follow this all through Trove. It's actually quite interesting, particularly because Ellen sued the tiler who took the tiles off. But he ultimately was only awarded damages for his salary, which was £14, and while he was forced to leave, the removal of the roof was the beginning of the end of the building, a problem which was reinforced by our second incident. So the second incident was in the early 1900s and concerned the Secretary Librarian George Cross. His story at the PMI began in 1869 with his employment agreement, which you can see on the screen and which is in that cabinet over there. But by the early 1900s, our letters show that he was virtually uncontactable. There's a lot of letters back and forth from the town clerk, just trying to work out how he became a member of the library. And he was too old to manage the collection or allow membership. So our membership dropped to pretty much nothing, and he let the collection fall into disrepair. When he was eventually removed from the position, much of the collection had to be burnt as it was very mouldy. It's partly due to the decrepit nature of the building, which hadn't been helped by taking the roof off. So the collection itself had been winnowed down by this point as well. This was partly through objections of members to certain material in the later 1800s and 1900s. In fact, at one point, the committee had to give assurances that books of questionable character were held separately. Unfortunately, nothing was recorded as to what was found to be questionable. So the collection was also reviewed and new books were added and subtracted, and books have gone missing, as happens in most collections. So we know all of this because of our next collection of rare books in the PMI story, which is our minute books. Sadly, we don't have our first one from 1854 to 1861. It disappeared completely, materialised in the 1980s in a locked cupboard, and then disappeared again. So if anyone ever comes across a random minute book, we'd really like to know about it. We have them from 1861 onwards though, and you can see those in display in the cupboard over there. As I said, the open one is open to the page where Reverend Potter is very upset about the letter that was written about him. All right, so, and we've also, these minute books really chart our history in the minutiae. There often isn't a lot of detail, but one of our volunteers has spent a lot of time going through and indexing them. So we actually now have a keyword searchable index of our entire run of minute books. And you can find that on our library computer. So that is a rare thing about a rare thing, which is really very exciting. All right, so to return to the main collection. Some of our earlier books might have survived, such as Victoria in 1880, which is this book just here and is in the cabinet over there. So while this book's not seriously rare, it's not common, and I wanted to mention it as part of the PMI story because we helped in its creation. We were a subscriber, so we were issued one when it was put out for the Melbourne exhibition of 1880, and while we don't know for certain that the copy we have is the copy that was originally gifted to us, because as I said, problems with the roof and faulty collections, it's still delightful to be part of its story. The book is a fascinating depiction of an admittedly idealised version of Victoria. Some of the images really do depict things you couldn't now imagine, but in some ways, Victoria in 1880 can be seen as the genesis of the PMI's Victorian History Collection, which is now the focus of the library. We also hold many other books on early Victoria, some of which were acquired later, mainly through donation from Prahran Library, but others we've held since they were printed. One of the really nice circular things about Victoria in 1880 is we were involved in crowdfunding for it to be printed. And last year we ran a crowdfunding campaign to have it repaired. So you can see it through restoration up on the screen now. And the copy that's over there, our restorer brought back at 2:30 this afternoon. So I was very pleased about that because it's a fairly key component of this discussion. All right. So, our story of the PMI has reached the 1900s. The PMI moved buildings in 1915, just as the war was beginning, to our new premises at 140 High Street, which is the building you can see here, and it actually looks pretty similar if you just go up to High Street now. We were there for the next 100 years. It was also where we started Prahran Technical College before leasing the space to the government to run it, but that's another whole story. So the war certainly had an impact, though the only mention of it in our letter archive is of special rates at the Prahran Tech for returned soldiers in 1918. World War I has become an important part of the PMI's collection though. We all hold nearly 550 books on World War I, many are general and could be found in most libraries or are easily accessible. But we also hold a significant number of battalion histories and histories of small towns' involvement, say like that one over there or that one, as well as histories of soldier settlements. World War I collecting is also a really good lens to examine collecting for the future, because we also have a reasonably significant World War I ephemera collection. But far from being old, most of this material is actually recent, as it was created during the centenary of World War I. While it might not seem rare now, some of the brochures you can see on the screen was the rare material of the future. I'll return to how we collect ephemera a bit more generally a little bit later. So my favourite book from this time period is actually one we acquired later, and like Victoria in 1880, it's not seriously rare, but it's not common either. So the Anzac book was created by soldiers under fire and was intended as a New Year's Eve celebration / diversion for the soldiers. Our copy was a donation from Prahran Library, but the reason I'm so fond of it is this plate in the front. I'm not sure if everyone down the back can read it, but I am only a small book, but I am your true friend, and I wish to make you happy and you certainly will be made more happy if I keep clean and good looking until I'm worn out, then you will be to have me get soiled and ragged. So will you please help me a little in this by never taking me up with dirty hands, never making marks on me with pen or pencil, never giving me to the baby to play with, never turning down my leaves, never leaning on me with your elbows, never letting me fall on the floor, never leaving me out in the rain, never putting pencils or knives or anything thicker than a sheet of paper between my leaves, and never throwing me at the dog or the cat or anything else. If you help me in these ways, I think I can keep strong and useful until you are growing to be men and women. Your loving friend, a library book. I particularly like the bit about not throwing it at the cat. In fact, they thought they needed to include that, and must mean it probably happened. All right, so now if we jump over a couple of decades where there really wasn't very much interesting happening at the PMI, we reach World War II. In a way, this was actually a boon for the PMI as they got involved, donating books to soldiers and camps, and membership went up. This is recorded again in the letters. We have many letters dedicated to this movement, and again, we have a strong collection on World War II. More than 590 books in total. Again, it's a mixture similar to what we hold on World War I. The ephemera collection isn't as strong, but it's something I expect will grow as we get closer to World War II centenary. So in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the PMI dwindled a little. Though the archives are an excellent collection of letters dealing with how our original building in Chapel Street, which was now leased as shops, you can see this amazing 1970s drawing plan on the screen. It's one of the most 70s things I've ever seen. Sorry, that's my spot. So the advantage, and there's a lot of information on the small scale of running a library. So the advantage of having been around for so long though, is that it's possible to purchase books when they come out originally, and thus they become rare. My favourite example is from 1967. This is an original edition of Picnic at Hanging Rock. It's unfortunately not worth very much because we stamped it and stickered it, but we're more interested in the information anyway. And it is its first edition. So you can see our original book plate in it, and you can see our original date due stamps, which I'm quite fond of. You can go from 1970 back to 2018. But this is actually our upcoming book club book for anybody who wants to get involved in our book club. So there will be more stamps on that. This is just a slightly old photo. I found this edition by accident a few years ago when I wanted to read the book. And after having been to Hanging Rock, and was really delighted to actually be able to borrow this first edition. I especially love the lettering that you get at the start of every chapter. It's all designed with little insects. And I also wanted to use Picnic at Hanging Rock to explain our fiction collection. So we collect Australian fiction by Australian authors, and we see it as a really important part of the zeitgeist and the social history of the time in which it was written. Australian books often rapidly become inaccessible, and a curated collection held together in one spot is rare in and of itself. It's crucially important that stories of Australia by Australians can easily be accessed because they shape how we see ourselves and our society into the future. Our fiction collection is also a really important part of our own voices collection, as minority groups are often writing their stories in fiction before they're writing them in non-fiction. We do have a focus on collecting prize winners, but it's a representative selection. Much of the older material we hold, like Picnic at Hanging Rock, are remnants of our general collection, which brings me to our specialisation. So the PMI was in decline by the 1980s. We had about 12 members. And the library was competing with other forms of entertainment and other lending libraries. Prahran Library has always been around the corner, but by the 1980s, there was a real question of why would you pay money to borrow all the same books you could just get around the corner. There was a move by the TAFE to take over the library. We've got petitions against that, and to try and force the PMI to amalgamate with the council library. So under Laurie McCorman, who is this gentleman here, he joined the PMI committee in 1980. An assessment of future direction was taken and a decision was reached to specialise in Victorian history, especially in local history of places in Victoria. So in 1984, Bruce Turner, who's this gentleman here, became Secretary Librarian, and it was under Bruce's leadership that the Victorian History Collection really began to take shape. He and Laurie worked with eminent academic historians to build the core of the PMI collection, which is our local histories. We have information on pretty much every town in Victoria, even some of the most obscure ones, and these are some of the rarest books in our collection. Collected at a time when there were very few copies available, and our existing collection of over 40,000 books owes its origins to these early years. Bruce also sourced books from all over the country, even going so far to write to the Danish consulate about a book about bikes. The PMI archives are a treasure trove of Bruce's letters as he chased down the rare, obscure and the wonderful. He also spent some time writing to the ABC telling them they need to put on a documentary about Christopher Columbus, but that's another whole story. So I love how these letters, as you can see, how we tracked everything down. Not all of it's relevant now, but we do have our 1980 succession registers, which is there, and again in the cabinet over there. So you can see how material was collected and how it was organised as it was collected. Biggest challenge for the PMI occurred in the 2000s when we desperately needed more space for various reasons, and we couldn't expand in 140 High Street for other various reasons. So in 2015, we moved to the building you're sitting in today. You can see what it originally looked like from the outside, and this was it after we had it done up. The building, there was building of some description on this site in the 1800s, and we think that might be part of what our existing building is. There's some very early brickwork. The building, as you see now, is a 1960s fabric factory that was converted into offices and then which the PMI turned into a library. So while we would have preferred to remain in our original building, the new PMI building has provided a lot more space and accessibility to the collection. Like, we actually have shelving for our stacks as opposed to boxes. And it's the reason the PMI exists. So this brings us to the present and the final thing I wanted to talk about. Acquiring rare books and material, both work that's already rare and work that will become rare. Some come into the collection through donations from members and other individuals, such as this amazing handwritten dictionary, which was donated in 2016. It's 27 volumes, and yes, it's in the cabinet over there, and it was written by Sydney surveyor Charles William Bray-King in the 1920s and 30s. The whole dictionary is handwritten, and essentially what happened was King decided that none of the contemporary dictionaries were good enough, so he wrote his own. He compiled the dictionary. It operates as a synonym dictionary, following each letter of the alphabet. It's completely unique. We also have quite a lot of individual family histories, where we might be the only place outside the immediate family who have ever been given a copy. Like these histories of the Fisher family, which were donated nowhere else, because it was a member who printed the copy just for us. We protect these sort of resources and make them available, even if they might seem too obscure. Other rare donations come from other institutions, like this petition from the early 1900s, which is in the cabinet over there, which the Supreme Court found in their archives and gave to us. It dates to 1908 and is a petition of people up and down Chapel Street, including their professions, which I have had quite a lot of fun working my way down reading what everyone was doing. And they're all attesting to a Middle Bayer's good character. So it's a wonderful snapshot of early 1900s Prahran. Other rare items come in bulk, like these heritage studies from the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. We received a large donation of these heritage studies a few years ago when the Victorian Government Libraries amalgamated. These heritage studies are often available nowhere else, and they become crucially important for heritage architects, developers, people fighting development. Yes, we've had people from both sides of the same development argument come in and borrow the same resources, and people undertaking more heritage and conservation studies. We make them accessible, and we often operate as a library of last resort because we don't weed on circulation. We don't care if it hasn't been borrowed for 20 years. It's one of these heritage studies, which is actually my favourite story, my favourite lockdown story about a reference query. So we were allowed on site in 2021 to run click and collect. And I had a heritage and conservation architect get in touch with me, and he had to know what a particular building was made of, and we had a 1920s heritage study that had a photo of it. The scans weren't telling him enough, so he sent one of his colleagues who worked within the 5 kilometres over, and I did the reference query by standing on the front step and doing this, so he could inspect the photo. So I didn't have to disinfect the book, and it meant we were 1.5 metres apart. So we provided help during lockdown as well. But while donations are important, the collection is very much curated, and that's a lot of what I do. Tracking down books that are rare now and will become rapidly rapidly become rarer. Because we specialise in even the smallest stories, I spend time tracking down even the most obscure books if they fit with the collection policy. For example, I recently brought a series of books on the birds, trees and fungi of the Druin district. So these cute little ones here. I only found that they existed because I spotted one on Facebook and messaged friends of Druin trees and found out that there are actually 3 others. I spend a lot of time emailing myself books I found on social media. Some books require a bit more work to find. Two of my favourite examples are a family history and a book on Mystic Park. Sometimes my job can be being a bit like being a detective. The family history, which I think I've got a cabinet over there somewhere, was about the Old Meadow family. It was called Before the Trumpet Sounds. I tracked it down by finding an inquest on Google that mentioned the place of work of the author, John Oldmeadow in Hobart. I then rang the shop and found that John did still own it, was in his 90s, and was really delighted to sell us his family history. When we received it, it's actually one of the most consistently interlibrary loaned items. The other book I wanted to talk about is this one of Mystic Park. So it's a Mystic Park Memories. So it's a history of Mystic Park and District written by Colin Hegan. This one was a request from a member, but it was published in 1993 and was impossible to find anywhere. So I contacted the Historical Society that I found had a copy, and they suggested a few bookstores in the vicinity of Mystic Park, but none of the local ones had heard of it. Luckily, the Historical Society had an idea of the aged care home the author had moved to, so I rang them and asked him, and Colin, who's the author, I got his daughter to photocopy the only copy of the book he had and bring it into the library. She told us that we really made his week and was really delighted that people were still interested in the work. And I was very happy that we managed to find a copy. Tracking down rare books also happens spontaneously. I talk to people when I'm anywhere, and I found that there are always books to be found. People love writing about their histories and their homes and their stories and their families. We also build relationships that people think of us when they write their next obscure book and send it in. We also collect and index the periodicals of pretty much every historical society in Victoria. This is material that becomes incredibly rare. So we're actually sometimes approached by historical societies for copies of their own periodicals that they don't have anymore. These hold the really small local stories that local people are writing about local things and are invaluable. Our ephemera collection, though, is the best example of collecting material that will become rare. The PMI ephemera collection began its life as a vertical file. A vertical file is clippings of articles, mainly from newspapers, and the PMIs is about Victoria, especially Victorian towns. Over the years, it also accumulated some brochures and other programs and pamphlets. Then in 2017, the decision was made to transition it away from newspaper clippings and focus on ephemera. This was partly because a lot of the clippings are available online. I was really sick of cutting them out too. So this has resulted in an immensely varied collection of everything from programs to brochures to maps to cookbooks. It also makes any travel PMI staff do interesting because we collect all the surrounding ephemera. This is my haul from 1 week in the Wimmera last year. It's not unusual for me to walk out of a tourist information place with half the contents. I like to play a game when I see how long it takes for someone to ask me why I'm collecting all of it. And I can usually talk staff and some people into photocopying information you're not normally allowed to take with you. Once you tell people that you work for a library, they're very helpful usually. Other people bring back other souvenirs, but yeah, as I said, this is my haul. And I have a wonderful volunteer who indexes all of it. She's been doing it for a few years and does a really fantastic job. And you can see some examples of Daylesford ephemera from over the years in one of the cabinets over there. We also do actively seek ephemera. I write to councils and historical societies and ask them to send us their brochures. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So it's both an organised and serendipitous collection. All new material is sorted into folders for indexing, and as I said, it's indexed by Sanjay, one of our dedicated. We have 27 volunteers who all work across different areas of the library and do an incredible job. I'm also volunteer coordinator, so I can't sing their praises enough. So all material in the ephemera collection is keyword searchable on the PMI's catalogue. So the ephemera collection contains nearly 15,000 individual items covering over 1,000 places and subjects. You can find folders for most Victorian towns and suburbs, from Abbotsford to Silsteins, and a wide range of subjects from alcohol to writers. So while there are many old brochures, and pamphlets, etc., in the ephemera collection, the modern material will become increasingly valuable and useful over time, as it isn't preserved anywhere else and it becomes unique and thus rare. So the ephemera collection also exemplifies the importance of collecting in many formats to acquire rare material. We also collect zines. For anyone that doesn't know what a zine is, these are tiny publications that often have a very small print run, as in 5 or 6. And they often tell very individual stories, and the idea is you're able to tell your story without the medium of a publisher getting in the way, so to speak. This is my haul from the Festival of Photocopier last year, which is the biggest thing fair held in Melbourne, usually March or February. We also have comics and graphic novels. So there's been a lot of interesting contemporary stories being told in this format, including quite a few on Black Summer of the 2019-2020. And again, these are often small print runs, meaning they become rarer as time passes. So you'll see quite a few zines and some of our comics and graphic novels in the cabinets over there. So we also collect poetry and plays, that is going to work, which covers a really wide variety of topics and often is a good way of collecting a rare voice that would not otherwise be included. We even collect movies. So what I have here is a very short clip from the film The Don of Trugo, a movie I acquired because I was at a Trugo club, and don't worry, if you don't know what Trugo is, you will in a second. I mentioned my work to the president of the club, and he gave me this 2002 movie on a USB stick. So it's an amazing microcosm of the time and the uniquely Melbourne sport of Trugo, which I will hopefully, if it works, film explain. That's not very long.
Trugo was invented in the 1920s, just down the road at the Newport Highway Yards. Where two workmen took wooden mallets and started to hit rubber rings at a gap between two lanterns. These rings were used as buttons between the carriages. And when the workman successfully sent the ring through the gap, well, his workmates yelled out, Trugo! These days, matches are played on grass courts. The pitch is 27.5 metres long, the length of the railway carriage. The width of the goal is 1.7 metres. That's the width between the railway lines. And a member from each team shoots from one end. Each goal is worth 1 point, and the team with most points in the game wins. Now, that's a true goal. Who wants a shot?
We have the whole film if you'd like to watch the rest of it at some point. It's available on our library computers. And the final point in collecting material that become rare is collecting unwritten material. This might sound like a bit of an existential concept. I promise I'm not going to get too all philosophical, but the core of it is recognising that not all stories are recorded and that not all history is written down, and working to fill that gap. This is particularly true of marginalised groups who are so busy fighting for existence that they usually aren't writing their own histories. We have a very small staff, so there's only so much we can do about this issue. So we do reach out to groups and encourage them to provide any form of the history that they can, or even just a small synopsis of their story so it can become part of the broader narrative. I'm an historian by training, so my raison d'etre is to have as many voices as possible so that you can see the broader picture. In the future, with a bit more time and more funding, we're hoping we might be able to use oral history to achieve some of the goal of collecting these unwritten voices. But I wanted to speak briefly about two examples. Firstly, queer history. So this photo's from Ida Hobbit Day, when our marketing officer had the lovely idea of getting me to pile up all our queer history and taking a photo of it. She didn't realise quite how much we had. I'm holding it because it wasn't structurally sound enough to stand up by itself. I did have a lovely rig of duct tape and rubber bands, but didn't photograph very well. And as you can see, I'm 6'1", so it's quite a lot of books. This was for Ida Hobbit Day. When I started here, our queer collection was pretty much zero. So this illustrates 7 years of work across a variety of formats to ensure that these stories are told. Some of these books are much more mainstream, but through relationships with Hares and Hyenas, which is a queer bookshop that's based at the Pride Centre, I have also been able to track down more rare and obscure material. Reaching out to communities is exemplified with our non-Christian religion books. We have hundreds of books in churches, so I've been running a program to collect the stories of other religion and religious buildings. I have 3 examples on the screen. So this is a history of Ethiopians in Victoria, written in Amharic. That's incredibly rare, as only a handful were printed. Got a history of the Kuan Yin Temple in Braybrook, which is written in Vietnamese, and a handful of books about Zoroastrians. So this one in particular is my favourite example of rare collecting. So I've been working with the Zoroastrian Association of Victoria since 2001 to help them write the history of Zoroastrians in Victoria. Very briefly, Zoroastrianism is the oldest monotheistic religion in the world. It predates both Judaism and Christianity. Most Zoroastrians in Victoria are Indian of origin because there was a Persian community that immigrated to India hundreds of years ago, and the Parsis came over here. So we worked together with them to actually write this history. We, with some of our funding, but mainly from them, we printed 20 copies and we're keeping 2. So I only picked this up about 3 weeks ago, so this is very new, very rare, and I'm very excited about it. We're keeping 2. One will also go to the National Library and one to the State Library, and then one to each of the families who contributed their story. And I wanted to finish with contemporary collecting, specifically COVID collecting. So in 2020, it rapidly became very clear that we were living in a period of history with a capital H. And I wanted to ensure that it was documented as it happened, not retrospectively. Why this is so important was made clear by our existing collection. We existed during the 1919 pandemic, and while we have lots of books written about it afterwards, there's only one letter in the archive actually written during that time. So I wasn't going to miss this opportunity this time. So we kept everything. Every sign we put up, every QR code, every density limit, and which they actually haven't been indexed yet, they're still waiting to be indexed. But when I was vaccinated at the showgrounds, I kept the sticker that said I was vaccinated, and I stuck it onto a piece of advice about COVID, and that's now in the ephemera collection. It is in fact in the cabinet over there. We also have a Christmas card with Santa wearing a mask, and of course books, which you can see on the screen. We have self-published, everything from a self-published books of all the birds one man saw in his park during lockdown, to professionally published accounts of nurses, to books written by kindergarten children, so this one here, about being in the bubble, to comics, to self-published books. My favourite title is actually from a zine I picked up at the end of the year, and I haven't got this on screen because I didn't have time to take a photo of it, but it's called Fuzzy Robes and Despair, which I think sums up the whole situation quite perfectly. So collecting rare materials, not just about collecting it for the sake of rarity, well, it's not for us anyway. It's about what they can tell us about our own history. And that brings me to the end of the story of the PMI told through our collection, so far anyway. I've held this position for 7 years, and it's been a privilege to have a nearly 170-year-old collection to grow and adapt, and to help make sure that it collects the stories of all aspects of Victorian history. Hope you found this interesting, and I'm now more than happy to answer questions. As you can see, I can look at this place underwater, so feel free. So, questions?
Do you still own the building on Chapel Street?
Yes, so we knocked it down in the early 1900s and rebuilt it, and it's one of the reasons we still survive, because we get rent from it. Yeah, it's currently occupied by a gym, a homeware store, and a very high-end men's underwear business.
Daily job.
Yes.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Do you have a digitisation project for some of the older?
Digitisation's a really tricky one because of copyright. So there's a lot of stuff you can't digitise, and book digitisation is really hard because you really should do it with proper scanning material, which we have nowhere near enough money. Most of our 1800s books you'll find have been digitised already by other organisations like Internet Archive or some of the biodiversity library stuff that the museum does. So ideally, yes, that would be lovely. In practice, someone needs to give us like $100,000.
Every year.
Yeah, pretty much, and more staff. But yeah, we're working on digitising everything we can. Like I'm digitising our movie and DVD collection at the moment, which we can do within copyright for preservation. Yes.
So any special book you want to get? You know, really important book.
I really enjoy tracking down the really random things. So like emailing specific clubs and seeing if they've got around to writing the history. I had quite a lot of I want to get more diverse voices in, is basically what I'm trying to work towards. So, like I've politely reminded several organisations, and I've got like one-page histories of a few mosques, which has been really nice. So that's at least in the collection and it can be looked up. So anything that gets me those really little voices are the stuff that I get excited about generally. I mean, ideally, yes, I like the old pretty books. Victorian 1880 is genuinely one of my favourites in the collection, but going forward, probably we'll be focusing on more contemporary little stuff.
What of this is actually driven by you? And what you collect on behalf of the,
Yes.
the PMI? Is there a difference between what you do and what the State Library does, for example?
Yes.
How you approach it, or do you collect different things? Do you
They-
compete?
No, we actually work quite well with the State Library. So using them as an example, we don't see it as competition. So the State Library collects everything. So not just Victorian stuff. So anything that is published in Victoria, no matter what it's about, the State Library has to collect legally. They're a legal deposit library. So we see ourselves as a smaller, specialised, curated collection. And we also loan. So that's one of our big points of difference, is you can borrow 90% of our collection, which obviously isn't true of the State Library, but we work quite well with them. So like when they get a donation where they either don't want the material or that they've already got some of it, they'll courier it over to us. So we've got quite a good, really nice donation of natural history and train books out of that in the last 6 months. And yeah, we talk to each other, and similar with the Royal Historical Society of Victoria, they're collecting in a very similar space, but they have a lot more objects and maps and pictures and all that kind of stuff. They also don't loan, and they don't buy new books, they rely on donations. So each of us, we're in the same sphere, but we all have our own little niche. And when you're a small organisation, you kind of have to work together, and the State Library has a lot more money than we do. So if they'd like to send some of their money in our
Yeah, so PMI doesn't now collect history of towns outside of Victoria?
No. So we used to, but we've just tied our collection policy down more strongly. It's primarily a space directive. So when I started, the collection policy was a page and was pretty general, which meant, look, it was doing its job to an extent, but it meant that personal preferences of staff had a much stronger influence on what's brought into the collection, when really the only rule is at the discretion of the Secretary Librarian. And we also had a really, really big donation in sort of mid-2000s of interstate material. It was pretty clear that no one else was doing what we're doing in other states, so a lot of that was kept. So in the 2018 collection policy I wrote when I was very new and still trying to work out what the hell was going on, we tied it down to just interstate towns, like no other interstate material. And in the policy that became active, which I wrote during lockdown, but we put into action started this year, it's no interstate material at all unless it has Victorian content or influence. And it's partly because there's already so much to collect, and partly because we're running out of space.
Yeah.
And if you want to see our collection policy, it's on the website.
So how many staff and how many volunteers?
27 volunteers at the moment. There'll be 28 shortly. It's a new, very nice new volunteer starting in the archives. And we have 5 staff?
5
Yeah,
staff.
5 staff. But yeah, we're not all full-time, so.
None of us are full-time.
Yeah, none of us are full-time. Yeah, very good point. Thank you. 2 of us are 4 days, 1 of us 2 days, two of us 2 days, and 1 of us 1 day. So we do a lot with not massive amounts of stuff.
How does your book club work?
Oh, yeah, so that's run by one of our volunteers, Raymond. So once a month, we have a chat about a book that book club picks. So it's always something from the collection.
In here?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's the first Tuesday of the month. The next one's Picnic at Hanging Rock. It'll be Tuesday next week. Yeah, that will be the 1st of August, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Next week or the week after. It's on the website. But yeah, it's always a really fascinating discussion that frequently gets off the topic of the book, but it's always interesting.
It's really good.
How many members?
870 last time I checked.
Is that ranked in activeness and things like that?
It's active, so it's $30 a year to join, and that gets you membership for 12 months. And you can borrow pretty much the whole collection. It's $100 for 5 years or $200 for life if you're over 60. And we are happy to take memberships tonight.
Helen, do you just want to explain about what your stacks is when you look at a catalogue?
Yeah, sure. So we have about half the collections upstairs, about half the collections downstairs. So we have a series of compactors. Anything that's in stacks you can access in the amount of time it takes one of the staff members to run downstairs, find it and bring it back up again. So that's one of our other points of difference. We say the State Libraries, everything's on site. And we also have library computers, and as I said, the ephemera collection. So we have over 6,000 electronic items. It's a collection that's growing faster than I can even come close to keeping up with it, because so much more stuff is born digital now. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. Oh, sorry, question at the back.
So I was just wondering, what percentage of the books do you buy? What would be donated?
It depends on if you're talking stuff introduced to the collection in a year, or if you're talking en masse donated. Because we get a lot of donated material, but it doesn't all get catalogued in a year. I'd have to check the annual report for the exact stats, but it'd be probably close to half, I would have thought. Yeah.
So with the stuff that you get donated en masse, if you've already got it, is that what ends up in your book
Yes,
sale?
absolutely. So we do run a second-hand bookshop, which is also online now, which you can find on our website. We're in the process of adding all the stuff to it. Our friends run that, do an amazing job. So anything that we get donated that doesn't fit with the collection or we've already got, we sell to raise money for the library. It's a really interesting selection of books, actually.
And cheap.
Yes, and cheap. So this is Jenny from our friends. So yeah, we price on the low side because we want them to go to, people donate stuff to us wanting it to go to a good home. So we try to achieve that, though we've had to start putting a thing on the website saying we can't promise everything is going to be a good home, because one of the head of our friends was driving around to nursing homes trying to offload stuff. So we do eventually recycle it if it doesn't sell.
And I saw the cinema club or something.
Yes, so we have 3 associated groups that work under the building. So Cinema and Theatre Historical Society, Tony, are you their secretary?
Sorry,
What's your actual role?
my role?
Yes, you can.
I'm
Yes,
a
committee
committee
member?
member and assistant archivist.
Yes, so Tony can answer any questions. We also have the Victorian Railway History Library, so they're in on Wednesday mornings and they have their collection across our back wall, and Mechanics Institute Victoria, who are sort of an umbrella body for mechanics institutes.
And what is the friend, is it the Friends of the Library?
Yeah, so they're part of our volunteers. So they're run by Wendy Elbridge, who is indefatigable, so much so that she had a dream that she won the lottery and she spent it on buying the building next door and building an air bridge to it. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, they run our book sale, they run the book club, the Family History Social Group, which is the last Tuesday of every month. And our amazing showcase, which is coming up on the 26th of August, which is going to be a whole collection of history groups. So we've got family history groups, we've got the Ambulance Historical Society bringing an antique ambulance, the state libraries coming, we've got an artist, and it's going to be one day all under one roof. You can ask everybody all your questions. Anything else? All right, yeah, so feel free, thank you for coming. Feel free to have a wander around, have a look at all the documents. I will be here to answer questions. I believe there was
Tea and
some
coffee.
Yeah, tea and coffee, help
Tea and
yourself. I
coffee.
believe there was some interest in the tour. I can show people around if you really want to do that. Otherwise, yes, enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for tonight's talk. It's been wonderful. Thank you.